Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming. They walk among us in plain sight, carrying secrets that could shatter your assumptions about strength, power, and what it truly means to be a warrior. This is the story of a woman who seemed ordinary, vulnerable even, until the moment her past collided with her present in the most unexpected way. What happens when bullies target someone they think is defenseless, only to discover they've just made the biggest mistake of their lives? What happens when mockery turns to terror, when laughter becomes stunned silence, and when the hunter realizes they've been stalking the apex predator all along? This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the invisible battles fought by those who serve in shadows, the price of keeping secrets that could save or destroy lives, and the moment when a carefully constructed ordinary life explodes into something extraordinary. Some people hide their strength behind smiles. Others behind silence. But, sometimes, the most dangerous people hide behind something else entirely, the assumption that they're weak. You're about to meet someone who mastered that art better than anyone else. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Harborview Physical Therapy Clinic as Sarah Martinez adjusted her ponytail and checked her patient schedule. At 28, she had the kind of quiet presence that made people feel safe, soft brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a gentle smile that never seemed forced, and hands that moved with practiced precision during treatment sessions. Her colleagues often joked that she had healing magic in her fingers, but Sarah just smiled and redirected the conversation. What none of them knew was that those same hands had once disarmed explosive devices in Afghanistan. The clinic buzzed with its usual morning energy. Elderly patients worked through their exercises while younger athletes pushed through recovery routines. Sarah moved between them with fluid grace, her voice calm. Encouraging as kind of, she guided a stroke victim through arm raises and helped a marathon runner stretch his injured hamstring. "Sarah, you've got a new patient in room 3, called Janet, the receptionist, from across the lobby. Workers' comp case. Looks like a tough one." "Real talk," Sarah nodded and grabbed the file. Marcus Reed, 34, construction foreman. Lower back injury from a job site accident. As she reviewed his information, she noted the insurance company's involvement and the suspicious timing of his injury claim. These cases were always tricky. Some patients genuinely needed help, while others saw an opportunity for an extended vacation with pay. She knocked gently on the door of room 3 and entered to find a large man sprawled across the treatment table, his work boots still muddy and his attitude immediately apparent. Marcus Reed looked her up and down with undisguised contempt, his lips curling into a sneer. "They sent me the girl?" Marcus scoffed, his voice carrying across the small room. "I namely asked for a male therapist. I don't need some little princess poking at me with her soft hands." Sarah maintained her professional smile. "Well, Mr. Reed, I'm Sarah Martinez, and I'll be handling your treatment plan. I've reviewed your case file, and I think we can make significant progress with your lower back issues, lol." Marcus sat up abruptly, wincing theatrically. "Listen, sweetheart, I work construction, and real work. Heavy lifting, dangerous equipment, 12-hour days. Plus, you look like you've never lifted anything heavier than a coffee cup. How exactly do you think you're gonna help me?" The other patients in the adjacent rooms had grown quiet, clearly listening to Marcus's raised voice. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with confrontation, but she pushed it down. She'd dealt with difficult patients before, though none quite this openly hostile. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Reed. Many patients feel more comfortable with therapists they perceive as similar to themselves. But I assure you that my training and experience are more than adequate for your needs." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that filled the small room. "I guess, training? You mean like massage school? Look at you, you probably grew up in some suburb, went to college on daddy's money, and now you think you understand what real pain feels like." He stood up, towering over Sarah's 5'4" frame. At 6'2" and built like the construction worker he was, Marcus clearly intended to intimidate her. Several other patients had gathered near the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus continued, his voice getting louder. "Women like you think you can do men's jobs, but when it comes down to it, you're just not built for it. You're weak. To be fair, soft. You probably cry when you break a nail. So yeah, Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, she'd faced down much worse than Marcus Reed. It was the familiar sensation of having to swallow her truth, to let someone diminish her while she smiled and nodded. But, this time felt different. This time, the weight of her hidden life pressed against her chest like a physical force. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice still steady, "why don't we focus on getting you back to work? I'd like to start with some basic assessments." "Basic?" Marcus interrupted. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about, which you want to do basic little exercises like I'm some weak old lady. I need serious treatment from someone who understands serious injuries. Not some girl playing dress up as a doctor." The crowd of onlookers had grown. Janet stood at the front desk, her hand hovering over the phone, unsure whether to call security or Sarah's supervisor. Other patients whispered among themselves, some looking uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior, others seemingly entertained by the confrontation. Marcus wasn't finished. "You know what? I'm gonna make, I think, some calls. This is discrimination, making me work with someone who's clearly not qualified. I bet you got this job because they needed to fill some diversity quota. Pretty face, check the right boxes, doesn't matter if you can actually do the work." Sarah's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, curled slightly. But she caught herself quickly, forcing her expression back to neutral. "I understand you're frustrated, Mr. Reed. Injuries, for what it's worth, can be stressful, especially when they affect your ability to work. However, I need to ask that you lower your voice. Other patients are trying to focus on their recovery." Marcus stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over her. "Don't you dare lecture me about stress, little girl. You have no idea what real stress looks like. You've probably never had a real challenge in your entire pampered life." The words hit something deep inside Sarah. Real challenges. If only he knew about the IED that nearly took her leg in Kandahar. If only he knew about the 3 tours that left scars no physical therapy could heal. If only he knew about the nights she still woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I think it would be best if we rescheduled your appointment. Perhaps after you've had time to, not gonna lie, run away?" Marcus laughed triumphantly. "Yeah, that's what I thought. When things get tough, girls like you just run away. You can't handle real confrontation because you've never faced anything real in your life." He grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed toward the door, but turned back for one final insult. You know what you're? You're everything that's wrong with this country. Weak people in important jobs, thinking their feelings matter more than getting real work done. People like you're why this place is falling apart." The room fell silent as Marcus stormed out, his heavy boots echoing in the hallway. The gathered patients slowly dispersed, some casting sympathetic glances at Sarah, others looking away uncomfortably. Janet approached cautiously. "Sarah, honey, are you okay? That man was completely out of line. I'm calling Dr. Patterson right now. We don't have to tolerate, honestly." "It's fine, Janet," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "These things happen. He's, in my opinion, probably just in pain and taking it out on whoever's convenient." But it wasn't fine. As Sarah returned to her other patients, maintaining her professional demeanor and gentle bedside manner, something had shifted inside her. For 7 years, she'd built a careful life around her civilian identity. She'd buried Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, former Army combat medic and Special Operations support staff, beneath layers of ordinary routine and quiet competence. The military had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate her wartime self from her peacetime self. In Afghanistan, she'd been part of a medical team that supported some of the most elite warriors in the world. She treated gunshot wounds under fire, performed emergency surgery in caves, and earned the respect of soldiers who trusted her with their lives. But, here, in this civilian world, she was just Sarah the physical therapist. Honestly, gentle Sarah. Soft Sarah. Sarah who probably cried when she broke a nail. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself distracted during treatments. Her usually perfect focus wavered as Marcus's words echoed in her mind. Other patients noticed her distraction. Mrs. Henderson asked twice if she was feeling well, and young Tommy Peterson, recovering from a skateboard accident, asked why she seemed kinda mad about something. During her lunch break, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at her was exactly what Marcus had seen: soft, feminine, unthreatening. Nothing in her appearance hinted at the warrior beneath. Nothing suggested that she'd once been trusted to keep some of the nation's most dangerous secrets. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former commanding officer, now retired and living in Colorado. The monthly check-in that all former Special Operations support staff received as part of their psychological monitoring program. "How are you holding up, Martinez? Civilian life treating you well?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "All good here, sir. Living the quiet life." One more thing, but, as she hit send, she wondered if that was entirely true. For the first time in years, the careful walls she'd built around her two identities felt fragile. Marcus Reed had no idea who he'd just insulted, but Sarah was beginning to remember exactly who she used to be. That evening, as she went through her usual routine, dinner alone, a few hours of reading, early bedtime, Sarah found herself thinking about her old team. She wondered where they were now, whether they ever missed the intensity of their shared purpose. She wondered if any of them struggled with the transition to ordinary life the way she sometimes did. In her bedroom dresser, buried beneath layers of sweaters, was a small wooden box. Sarah hadn't opened it in over 2 years, but tonight she found herself pulling it out and setting it on her bed. Inside were her medals, her commendations, and a single photograph of her medical team standing in front of a helicopter in Afghanistan. In the photo, she wore full combat gear, her face confident and alert. She looked strong, dangerous, even. Nothing like the soft woman Marcus Reed had dismissed so easily. Sarah closed the box and put it away, but the image of her younger self stayed with her as she tried to sleep. Tomorrow, she would return to the clinic and continue being gentle Sarah, the physical therapist. She would smile at difficult patients and absorb their frustrations with professional grace. But something had awakened inside her today. Something that had been sleeping for a long time was beginning to stir. And Sarah wasn't entirely sure she could keep it buried much longer. The last thing she thought before falling asleep was how Marcus Reed had called her weak. If only he knew that weakness was just another tool in her arsenal, one she'd learned to wield as effectively as any weapon she'd ever carried. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Reed's outburst, and Sarah had almost convinced herself that the incident was behind her. Almost. But the truth was that something fundamental had shifted in those moments, when he'd called her weak, when he'd dismissed everything she was based on what he thought he saw. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at the clinic early, reviewed her patient files, and prepared for another day of routine treatments. What she didn't expect was to find Marcus Reed waiting in the lobby, flanked by 2 other men who looked like they'd stepped off the same construction site. Well, Marcus said loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the waiting area. "If it has sent the princess herself." Sarah maintained her professional composure as she approached the front desk. "Mr. Reed, I don't see you on today's schedule. Did you need to reschedule your appointment?" "Not gonna lie," Marcus laughed, and his companions joined in. "Reschedule? Nah, I came by to introduce you to some friends of mine. Boys, meet Sarah, the little girl who thinks she can fix grown men." The 2 men with him were cut from the same cloth, large, intimidating, and clearly enjoying the show. The taller one, who introduced himself as Dave, looked Sarah up and down like she was something amusing he'd found on his shoe. "This is the one giving you trouble, Marcus? She looks like she weighs about 90 pounds soaking wet." The second man, younger and meaner looking, crossed his arms over his massive chest. "My name's Tony. Marcus here was telling us about how you can't handle real patients. Says you, in my opinion, tried to give him some girly exercises like he was in a yoga class." Sarah could feel the eyes of every patient and staff member in the lobby on them. Janet had already picked up the phone, probably calling security, but Sarah held up a hand to stop her. Something about this situation felt different from Marcus's previous outburst. This felt planned. Plus, gentlemen, Sarah said calmly, this is a medical facility. If I think you don't have appointments, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Marcus stepped closer, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby. See, that's your problem right there. Always trying to run away from confrontation, and always hiding behind rules and policies because you know you can't handle the real world. Dave nodded in agreement. Marcus told us all about you. College girl playing doctor, thinking you're better than working people. You probably never did a real day's work in your life. Never got your hands dirty, Tony added. Never faced any real danger, which just lived in your safe little bubble, judging people like us. But that's just me. Sarah felt that familiar cold settle in her stomach, but this time it was different. This wasn't just one angry patient having a bad day. This was deliberate harassment, designed to humiliate her in front of her colleagues and patients. And something about their coordination, their practice timing, suggested this wasn't their first time doing something like this. You know what I think? Marcus continued, his voice getting louder. I think you need to learn what real strength looks like. What real toughness is. Maybe if you understood what actual hard work felt like, you'd have some respect for people who do it. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The three men had positioned themselves to block Sarah's easiest path to the exit, and their body language had shifted from mockery to something more aggressive. Other patients were starting to look nervous, and Sarah could see Janet frantically whispering into the phone. Mr. Reed, Sarah said, her voice still steady, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant to suggest, just my take. There's no misunderstanding, Dave interrupted. You look down on people like us. Think we're stupid. Think we're beneath you. Tony stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Sarah. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about respect. For 7 years, Sarah had carefully maintained her civilian persona. She'd swallowed insults, absorbed criticism, and let people underestimate her because it was easier than explaining who she really was. But, as she looked at the 3 men surrounding her, something inside her finally snapped. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder and far more dangerous. It was the realization that her careful disguise had become a trap, and these men thought they had cornered something helpless. A lesson about respect? Sarah asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The change in her tone was subtle, but Marcus caught it. For just a moment, his confident smirk faltered. Something in Sarah's eyes had shifted, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Yeah, he said, but with less certainty than before. Maybe you need to understand what it's like to feel powerless. What it's like to be at someone else's mercy. And, honestly, Sarah looked at each man in turn, her gaze clinical and assessing. Dave was favoring his left leg slightly, old injury, probably knee damage. Tony kept touching his lower back, chronic pain from poor lifting technique. Marcus himself showed signs of the back injury that had brought him to the clinic in the first place, despite his aggressive posturing. All 3 men were large and intimidating, but Sarah had learned long ago that size meant nothing if you didn't know how to use it properly. More importantly, she could see that they were bullies, used to their victims backing down at the first show of force. They had no idea what to do with someone who didn't. You want to teach me about feeling powerless? Sarah asked, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge that made several nearby patients step back instinctively. That's right, Marcus said, though he was starting to look less certain. Time for you to learn. And, honestly, Sarah moved. It happened so fast that most of the observers weren't sure what they'd seen. One moment, the 3 men were crowding around her threateningly. The next, Dave was on the ground clutching his knee, Tony was bent over gasping for air, and Marcus found himself face down on the lobby floor with Sarah's knee pressed against his spine and his arm twisted at an uncomfortable angle behind his back. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds. Security will be here in about 2 minutes, Sarah said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather instead of restraining a man twice her size. "I'd suggest you all stay very still until they arrive." The lobby was dead silent except for Dave's whimpering and Tony's labored breathing. Every patient, every staff member, every person in the building stared in shock at the gentle physical therapist who had just dismantled 3 grown men like they were children. "You see, sort of, gentlemen," Sarah continued, her voice still eerily calm, "you made an assumption about me. You thought that because I look a certain way, because I work in a medical clinic, because I didn't immediately fight back, that I was weak. That I was helpless." Marcus struggled beneath her hold, but Sarah applied just enough pressure to his twisted arm to discourage further movement. "The thing is, I spent 8 years in the army. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Plus, I was a combat medic attached to special operations units." Dave tried to get up, but Sarah's peripheral vision caught the movement and she shifted her weight slightly, somehow managing to keep Marcus pinned while also keeping Dave on the ground with just a look. "Do you know what combat medics do in special operations?" Sarah asked. "We don't just patch up wounded soldiers. We're trained to keep ourselves and our patients alive in the most dangerous situations on Earth. We're taught to fight, to survive, and to never, ever give up." Tony was finally catching his breath, but he made no move to help his friends. Something in Sarah's demeanor had changed so completely that he couldn't reconcile this person with the soft woman they'd been harassing moments before. "I've treated gunshot wounds while under enemy fire," Sarah continued. "I've performed emergency surgery in caves while mortars exploded outside. I've carried wounded soldiers twice my size to safety through hostile territory." Marcus made another attempt to break free, and this time Sarah shifted his arm just enough to send a sharp spike of pain through his shoulder. He stopped struggling immediately. "But here's the thing about being underestimated," Sarah said, and now her voice carried a hardness that made everyone in the lobby unconsciously step back. "Sort of, it's actually quite useful. People like you see what they expect to see. A small woman, to be fair, in civilian clothes must be weak. Basically, must be helpless. Must be someone you can intimidate and humiliate without consequences." The security guards finally arrived, 2 large men who took one look at the scene and stopped short. Janet quickly filled them in on what had happened, though she could barely believe her own words as she spoke them. "The TBH, beautiful thing about people like you," Sarah said to Marcus, "is that you're so convinced of your own superiority that you never bother to actually assess your target. You just, assume that because someone doesn't look dangerous, they're dangerous." She released Marcus's arm. Stood up gracefully, stepping back to give the security guards room to work. Marcus rolled over slowly, his face pale and his attitude completely deflated. "Did you know," Sarah said, addressing all 3 men as the guards helped them to their feet, "that the people I used to work with, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, they specifically requested me for their medical team? Do you know why, The thing is," the 3 men said nothing, but Sarah could see the question in their eyes. "Because pretty much, when the shooting started, they knew NT break. They, I think, knew I could patch them up and get them home alive, no matter what hell was raining down around us. Some of the most elite warriors in the world trusted me with their lives." She looked directly at Marcus, her expression calm but her eyes holding depths he couldn't fathom. "So when you called me weak, when you suggested I'd never faced anything real in my life, you weren't just wrong. You were insulting 8 years of service, 3 Bronze Stars, and the memory of soldiers who didn't make it home." The security guards were leading the 3 men toward the exit, but Sarah wasn't finished. "One more thing, gentlemen," she called after them. "The reason I work in physical therapy now isn't because I couldn't handle the military. It's because I chose to use my skills to help people heal instead of just patching them up so they could go back to war." As the doors closed behind them, the lobby remained silent for several long moments. Then, slowly, one of the elderly patients began to clap. Others joined in, until the entire room was applauding. But Sarah barely heard them. She was thinking about the wooden box in her dresser, about the medals she'd earned and the soldiers she'd saved. For 7 years, in my opinion, she'd tried to be someone else, someone gentler and less complicated. But maybe, she thought, there was value in being exactly who she was. Janet approached cautiously. Sarah, are you okay? That was. Plus, I'd no idea you could. I'm fine, Janet, Sarah said, and, for the first time in years, she really meant it. I'm exactly fine. As she returned to her patients, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the military, the satisfaction of being fully herself. No more hiding, no more pretending to be weaker than she was. The secret was out now, and, surprisingly, the world hadn't ended. In fact, actually, it felt like it was just beginning. The video went viral within hours, and someone in the lobby had been recording when the confrontation started, initially thinking they were capturing another customer service nightmare for social media. Instead, they documented something extraordinary: a small physical therapist single-handedly dismantling 3 large men who were trying to intimidate her. But the video was just the beginning. By evening, news outlets had picked up the story. Local physical therapist reveals military background in dramatic fashion, read one headline. When bullies pick the wrong target, read another. The clinic's phones hadn't stopped ringing all day: reporters, interview requests, and calls from people wanting to know more about the mysterious Sarah Martinez. Sarah sat in Dr. Patterson's office, watching her supervisor pace behind his desk. The clinic owner was a kind man in his 60s who'd hired Sarah based on her excellent credentials and gentle demeanor. He looked like he was trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of the same person. Sarah, he finally said, settling into his chair, I think we need to talk about what happened today. I gotta say, I understand if you need to let me go, Sarah replied calmly. I know this isn't the kind of publicity the clinic usually let you go. Dr. Patterson interrupted. Sarah, my phone has been ringing off the hook all afternoon. Half the calls are from reporters, sure, but the other half are from people who want to book appointments with you specifically. We're booked solid for the next 3 months. He leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. But, I've to ask, why didn't you tell me about your military background? This level of training, these skills, I'd no idea. Sarah had been dreading this conversation all day. How do you explain 8 years of keeping secrets? How do you tell someone that you've been hiding the most fundamental part of who you're? It's complicated, Dr. Patterson. When I left the army, I wanted to be normal. I wanted to help people without the weight of everything that came with my military service. What exactly did you do in the army, Sarah? Because what I saw today wasn't standard medical training, honestly. Sarah took a deep breath. She'd spent so many years carefully avoiding this conversation, but, after today's events, there was no point in continuing the charade. I was to be fair, combat medic, but not the typical kind. I was part of a special medical unit that supported elite operations. We were, trained not just to treat wounded soldiers, but to operate in the most dangerous environments imaginable. We had to be fighters as much as healers. Dr. Patterson nodded slowly. And those men today had no idea who they were dealing with. No, Sarah said quietly. They saw exactly what I've spent 7 years making sure people see: a soft, harmless woman who couldn't possibly be a threat to anyone. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. Military bloggers had started digging into Sarah's background, and what they found made the initial incident seem even more remarkable. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any combat medic, she was a legend in special operations circles. The first detailed article appeared on a veteran's website 3 days later. The headline read, "The Angel of Kandahar Comes Home." The story revealed that Sarah had been part of a classified medical unit that had saved over 300 lives during her 3 tours. She'd been awarded 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Silver Star for valor under fire. But it was the personal testimonials that really caught the public's attention. Doc Martinez saved my life in 2018, wrote former Navy SEAL Marcus Thompson. I took, shrapnel from an IED, and she performed surgery on me in a bombed-out building while enemy fire was coming through the windows. Never once did her hands shake. Never once did she show fear. She was the most badass person I ever served with, and I served with some pretty badass people. So yeah, another testimonial came from Army Ranger Captain James Rodriguez. We called her the Angel because she seemed to appear out of nowhere whenever someone got hurt. But she was tougher than half the Rangers in my unit. I watched her carry a wounded soldier twice her size through 2 miles of hostile territory. She was legendary among special ops units. The stories kept coming. Sarah, to be fair, had apparently been requested by name for the most dangerous missions because elite units knew she wouldn't break under pressure. She'd treated wounded soldiers during active firefights, performed emergency amputations in field conditions that would challenge experienced surgeons, and earned the absolute trust of some of the military's most elite warriors. But perhaps the most telling testimony came from her former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes. Sarah Martinez was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command. She, in my opinion, could have stayed in the Army and risen to the highest levels of military medicine. The fact that she chose to come home and use her skills to help civilians shows the same courage she displayed in combat. She's still serving, just in a different uniform. The media attention was overwhelming, but what surprised Sarah most was the response from her patients. Instead of being intimidated by her revealed background, they seemed to trust her even more. Honestly, Mrs. Henderson, the stroke victim Sarah had been working with for months, put it best during their next session. "Honey, knowing what honestly you've been through, what you've seen and done, it just makes me feel safer. If you could take care of wounded soldiers in a war zone, I know you can help me get my arm working again." The sentiment was echoed throughout the clinic. Patients began requesting Sarah specifically, not despite her military background, but because of it. Word spread, for what it's worth, that Harborview Physical Therapy had a therapist who'd literally been battle-tested, someone who understood pain and trauma in ways that most medical professionals never would. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah was approached by a man she didn't recognize. He was waiting outside the clinic when she arrived for work, and something about his posture and bearing immediately identified him as military. "Doc Martinez?" he asked, approaching with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "Yes?" Sarah replied cautiously, which the man extended his hand with a broad smile. "Master Chief Petty Officer David Chen, Navy SEALs. I wanted to meet the legend in person." Sarah shook his hand, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Not directly, but I know who you're." "Hell, every SEAL on the West Coast knows who you're now. You treated my teammate Danny Rodriguez in Afghanistan in 2019. He told me you saved his life while mortars were exploding around your field hospital." I gotta say, the memory came flooding back. Rodriguez had taken a sniper's bullet through the chest, and Sarah had worked on him for 4 hours straight while their position was under siege. She'd refused to leave him, even when her commanding officer ordered the medical team to evacuate. "How is Rodriguez?" Sarah asked, and, "Alive and, well, thanks to you," Chen replied. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because word has gotten around about what you did to those 3 idiots, and, frankly, it's the best thing that's happened to the veteran community in years." Chen explained that Sarah's story had become something of a rallying cry among veterans. Here was someone who'd served with distinction, transitioned successfully to civilian life, but hadn't forgotten who she was or what she was capable of when pushed too far. "You know, what the best part is?" Chen asked. For years, people have had this image of female veterans as either victims or trying to prove they're as tough as men. But, you just went about your business, helping people, being excellent at your job. And, TBH, when some bullies decided to test you, you reminded everyone exactly why elite units fight to have you on their teams. Over the following months, Sarah's life changed in ways she hadn't expected. The clinic expanded, hiring additional staff to handle the increased patient load. Sarah was invited to speak at veterans events and medical conferences. A major publisher approached her about writing a book about her experiences. But perhaps the most meaningful change was internal. For the first time since leaving the Army, Sarah felt like she could be her complete self. She no longer had to hide her strength behind a carefully constructed facade of softness. She could be both things at once, the gentle healer who helped patients through their recovery, and the warrior who'd earned the respect of some of the military's most elite units. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing up with her last patient of the day, Janet called her to the front desk. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you, says he's an old friend." Sarah looked up to see a familiar figure in the lobby, tall, graying at the temples, with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. Colonel Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer, stood waiting with a smile on her face. "Colonel, I guess, Hayes," Sarah said, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here?" "One more thing, I'm retired now, actually." "Pretty much, it's just Patricia. And I'm here because I wanted to see how you were doing. The real you, not the version you've been hiding behind for the past 7 years." They sat in Sarah's office, talking for over an hour about military life, the challenges of transitioning to civilian careers, and the price of carrying secrets. "You know," Patricia said as their conversation wound down, "I always wondered if you'd made the right choice, leaving the military. You were one of the most naturally gifted soldiers I ever commanded. You could basically have gone anywhere, done anything in the army. Do you think I made the wrong choice?" Sarah asked. Patricia smiled. "After seeing, in my opinion, this place, meeting your patients, watching how you've built a life here? No, look, I think you made exactly the right choice. You're still serving, Sarah, and you're still saving lives. You're just doing it without the uniforms and the medals." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But I'm glad you finally let people see who you really are. Hiding that part of yourself wasn't protecting you, it was just making you smaller than you really are." Here's the thing, as Patricia left, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Marcus Reed had walked into her clinic looking for someone to bully. He'd expected to find a weak target, someone he could intimidate and humiliate. Instead, he'd awakened something that had been sleeping for too long. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to make her feel powerless, Marcus had actually returned her power to her. In attempting to diminish her, he'd forced her to remember exactly who she was. That evening, Sarah opened the wooden box in her dresser and looked at the photograph of her medical team in Afghanistan. The woman in that picture looked confident, capable, and completely unafraid. For the first time in years, Sarah recognized her as the same person looking back from the mirror. She was still gentle Sarah, the physical therapist who helped people heal. But now she was also Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, combat medic, Silver Star recipient, and the woman elite warriors had called the Angel of Kandahar. She wasn't hiding anymore, and she was exactly who she was supposed to be, all of it, at once. And, for the first time since coming home from war, Sarah Martinez was completely at peace with herself. The last thing she thought before going to sleep that night was how Marcus Reed had unknowingly given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to stop being afraid of her own strength. Somewhere across town, Marcus Reed was probably still trying to figure out what had hit him. He'd never know that in targeting what he thought was the weakest person in that room, he'd actually picked a fight with one of the strongest people he'd ever encounter. Sometimes, Sarah thought as she drifted off to sleep, the most dangerous people really are the ones you never see coming.